We suffer from a modern arrogance. We look back at the ancient world and assume it was isolated, primitive, and disconnected. We are completely wrong. In the year 1200 BCE, humanity had built an incredibly complex, highly globalized matrix of superpowers. But within a single human lifetime, an unstoppable army hit the delete button on civilization. The destruction was so absolute that humanity was plunged into a 300-year dark age, completely forgetting how to read and write. We are going to decode the terrifying warnings left behind by dying kings to uncover the true identity of the Sea Peoples. In this video, we are investigating the ultimate ancient system reset, from the first globalized supply chains to the apocalyptic ghost armada, to the chilling geological data that proves this wasn't just a war. It was a complete systems failure.
Erase the myth of the primitive past. The Late Bronze Age was not a time of isolated tribes scattered in the dirt. It was a highly functional international corporate landscape. Imagine a world controlled by massive, interconnected superpowers: the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Babylonians. They operated with a sophistication that perfectly mirrors our modern global alliances. But this entire era was defined by one crucial technology: bronze. And bronze requires a very specific, unforgiving recipe of copper and tin. Here is where the terrifying logistical nightmare begins. While copper was mined relatively close by in Cyprus, tin had to be imported from thousands of miles away, carried over brutal terrain from the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan. Just like your modern life relies entirely on microchips shipped across the Pacific Ocean, their fundamental survival depended completely on tin shipped across treacherous ancient highways. It was the ancient equivalent of crude oil. This deep technological dependency forced a fragile brilliance upon the era. The kings of these great empires didn't just wage war, they wrote polite diplomatic letters to one another. They married into each other's royal families to secure trade alliances, and they maintained a highly profitable era of global peace. They built a grand machine of unprecedented prosperity. But this golden age relied entirely on a sprawling international supply chain that stretched across the known world. The empires believed their interconnected wealth made them completely unbreakable. They didn't realize that in a highly optimized system, if a single pillar falls, the entire world burns. The golden age ends, but it doesn't slowly fade into twilight. It violently shatters. And the collapse is terrifyingly swift, unfolding in a strict, brutal window of roughly 50 years. We know exactly what the panic looked like because we have the primary sources. We have the desperate letters kings sent to each other right before they died, baked into clay by the very fires that burned their cities to the ground. In the ashes of Ugarit, archaeologists found a panicked dispatch from a king begging for military aid. He wrote that enemy ships had arrived, that his own troops were far away, and that his country was abandoned to the slaughter. He never sent it. The city was destroyed before the clay could dry. The Egyptians frantically recorded the arrival of an overwhelming seaborne confederation they called the Sea Peoples. This invasion was methodical and absolute. The Sea Peoples moved down the Mediterranean coast, systematically crushing the greatest military superpowers on Earth. They dismantled the Hittite Empire. They wiped out the Mycenaeans. They burned massive, heavily fortified stone cities to the ground, leaving behind thick layers of black ash. And then they completely vanished into the shadows of history without leaving a single written record of their own. The Sea Peoples didn't just conquer the Mediterranean, they broke the actual mechanisms of civilization, and the fallout was a psychological catastrophe that humanity barely survived. We have to understand the difference between losing a war and losing a civilization. When a modern nation loses a war, the buildings, the roads, and language usually remain, The destruction of the Bronze Age was an intellectual deletion. When the cities burned, the international trade routes instantly froze. Without trade, there was no tin. Without tin, there was no bronze. The global economy ground to a permanent halt. This ushered in a 300-year dark age that is almost impossible to comprehend. The collapse of the central governments meant scribes were no longer trained. In Greece, the societal collapse was so thorough and so devastating that human beings actually forgot how to read and write. Centuries of scientific, cultural, and architectural progress were permanently erased overnight. If the terrifying reality that humanity can simply forget its own written language gave you chills, hit subscribe to join the Center for Curiosity. For thousands of years, historians assumed the Sea Peoples were an unstoppable matrix of evil, bloodthirsty pirates. But modern science recently dug into the dirt beneath the burning cities and found a much darker truth. How do you solve a 3,000-year-old murder mystery? You stop looking at the weapons, and you start looking at the weather. By extracting hidden data from fossilized pollen and ancient stalagmites located deep within the Mediterranean basin, modern archaeoclimatology has revealed a staggering truth. Exactly during the 50-year window of the collapse, the region was hit by a massive, multi-decade megadrought. The rains completely stopped. Crops failed. Famine swept across the northern lands. To make matters exponentially worse, geological fault lines became incredibly active, triggering an earthquake storm that actively shattered the city walls. And here is the terrifying twist. The Sea Peoples were not an evil empire of conquerors. They were an apocalyptic swarm of starving, desperate climate refugees fleeing a dying, barren ecosystem. They put their families on boats and ox carts and pushed south because they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The invaders were just starving farmers and broken families. But starving refugees shouldn't be able to defeat the greatest militaries on Earth, unless the superpowers had already defeated themselves. We must acknowledge the chilling mirror this ancient collapse holds up to us. The kings of the Bronze Age believed their complex globalized trade networks made them invincible. The exact opposite was true. Complexity breeds fragility. Today, we live in the most hyper-connected, globalized, and fragile supply chain era in human history. Just like their survival depended on tin shipped from Afghanistan, our modern world relies entirely on fragile networks of digital data, microchips, and foreign manufacturing. If a localized drought in 1200 BCE could trigger a 300-year dark age, what is the exact breaking point of our own system? What happens when our digital bronze trade stops?